Hi everyone, and welcome back. In recognition that my schedule's not going to be very clear for a while, I'm doing another quick video, this one on the Catholic response to the Reformation. So, to kind of understand what was happening to the Catholic Church leading to the Renaissance and the Reformation, we need to remember that actually, for a good chunk of time, the Catholic head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, was actually in Avignon, France. And for actually a good chunk of the period that would encompass the rise of the Hundred Years' War, and through a good chunk of it, the popes were in Avignon, and even when they returned, the influence of France did, especially in the late Capet, early Valois dynasty, um, French bishops and French influence did rival that of Rome and more moderate outside groups, which is kind of why we do see the schism, the Western Schism, and while for the most part, what how much that actually changed the lives of people that weren't part of the upper nobility is questionable. It did lead to a bit of a power vacuum and complications that would kind of be lead to kind of openings for figures like the Hussites to kind of rise up. While Emperor Sigismund of the House of Luxembourg would take over the HRE and of the Council of Constance and reestablish the papacy in Rome and also deal pretty harshly with the Hussites because of how how much power princes could actually hold over the church. It led to kind of the papacy being afraid of councils and fearing the power of princes again, especially as popes during the Renaissance were trying to reestablish their holds over their papal states. So, so because of this and the centralization of power in England and Spain and France, especially once France starts to recover from the Hundred Years' War, it led many to kind of recognize that the princes of Europe actually have power over their realms to kind of pick and choose what they want to hear from the papacy, which is kind of why when the Council of Trent started, getting figures from France to actually come to the table was an issue. But that's kind of getting ahead of myself. So, why wasn't a council immediately held after the rise of the Reformation? A lot of that is because the popes kind of didn't want to address it right away. Because of their fear of councils and fear that having a council during the middle of the Italian Wars between Francis and Charles could lead to the princes wanting to reform the Pope itself. But after the failed siege of Vienna in the 1500s and the sacking of Rome and the Pope kind of being held hostage for a bit, some agreement to a council was enforced. But because it was more of an agreement, things kind of dragged, and it wasn't until the papacies of Pope Paul III to Pope Pius IV that any real movement and change could happen. It also kind of meant that a changeover of European leadership had to happen. For instance, the rise of Bavaria, the switching of the Habsburgs' heads from Charles V to Philip II of Spain and Ferdinand taking over the HRE. France being taken over by Catherine de' Medici. And so the Catholic response in Trent was that, one, they would actually adopt humanist ideals that were outlined by figures like Erasmus, actually listen to the more observant branches of monastics, utilizing the printing press, having some evangelizing influence, having educational orders like the Jesuits and Ursulines, accepting especially as Catholicism through the Portuguese and Spanish empires, accepting some syncretization of local cultural traditions into the local Catholic churches. Alongside that, enforcing seminaries, actually making bishops, priests, and upper levels of dioceses actually acknowledging their clerical duties, hammering away at absenteeism, enforcing some legal precedent for indulgences, recognition of marriage as a sacrament, reinforcing the real presence of the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist. While there wasn't any real reform to the position of the Pope, the power of the bishoprics did lessen. There were mentions about whether or not there should be reforms that allowed priests in the Catholic Church to marry, but because of fears of sexual misconduct, which is ironic because we're only 5 decades out from the Borgia papacy when the Council of Trent happened. Basically, we aren't talking about what we would now call wide-ranging reforms. The Council of Trent was more of establishing kind of what we would now today call a solid political and philosophical and theological basis of what being Catholic meant. Alongside that, we also kind of have like outline of faith so that the Catholic Church had a catechism. And while they would accept some translations of the Bible, they still wanted to kind of enforce the Vulgate or the Latin Bible, although they did acknowledge that maybe coming through it and looking for errors was needed. So, and when we're talking about the Catholic response, when we're talking about the Council of Trent, the Inquisition is brought up. And yes, I know Monty Python. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. But we do need to discuss what the Spanish Inquisition was. So, the Spanish Inquisition was kind of a reaction of the fact that medieval Spain, especially during the Reconquista, was a multicultural, pluralistic peninsula. It's a recognition that there were Muslims, there were some Arabs that kind of even dated back to the Umayyads living there. There were North African cultures, the Berbers. You also kind of had holdouts of Basque peoples. You even have you have Jews. There were just a lot of different groups in what we would now call Spain and Portugal, and in a lot of ways, people kind of hope that with the finishing of the Reconquista, a balance between centralization and respecting kind of territories of Aragon, Portugal, Castile Leon, and Navarre would be respected. It didn't really work out that way because by the time the Reconquista was over, yes, Portugal was forming its empire effectively. You also had Castile Leon after a secession crisis and the final taking of Granada. Isabel Castile as one of the most powerful figures on the European continent with her husband Ferdinand. Now, they would try to rule each other's lands jointly and have a firm game plan of what they wanted. And this kind of dual kingship over Aragon and Castile, kind of trying to rule jointly without a clear-cut unification, would last up to the War of Spanish Succession. It's Spain, but with different political legal groups running. And because Spain for once was mostly unified, Isabella came up with the Inquisition with Ferdinand as a way to kind of try to create a Spanish identity, one faith, one people, and in a lot of ways, it was meant to kind of have Spain have its own religious, political, legal system. And in a lot of ways, because its power was limited and tied to the church, outside of the expulsion and the heresy trials, in a lot of ways, it was more of enforcement of ideals and kind of a cultural standard. Like in a lot of ways, it was terrible in the fact that the expulsion and Inquisition forced Jewish communities to either try to hide out in North Africa, move to the Ottoman Empire, where in a lot of ways they would help lay the groundwork of a resettlement of Palestine, modern day Israel, and moved towards the Netherlands. But in that vein, the, the Inquisition led to this Black Legend period of what the Spanish Empire was like. And the reality of what the Inquisition is mixed because it was devastating for several groups, while at the same time its effects that don't really compare to the nightmare scenario we think of. And in a lot of ways, in areas like witch trials, it actually required a higher level of evidence. And heck, it really can't even go after brothels or prostitutes because they didn't have the power or influence to ban them outright. In a lot of ways, they were just trying to set up a standard of political and religious uniformity, and unfortunately, if you didn't meet those standards, then you would get some nightmare scenarios. So, this is the Catholic reaction. Hope you enjoyed.